Break Fix's History of Motorsports series is brought to you in part by the International Motor Racing Research Center, as well as the Society of Automotive Historians, the Watkins Glen Area Chamber of Commerce, and the Argetsinger family.
Well, my name is Kip Zider. For those who may not know, I'm the Visitor Services Outreach Coordinator for the International Motor Racing Research Center. And I want to welcome you all here. Thank you for taking a little time out of your afternoon to come visit us as we talk about open wheel madness. Before we get going, I have several people I need to thank on this. First of all and foremost of all are our two speakers, Mr. Herb Anastor and Stephen Bubb. When we were considering putting this program together, I emailed Lenny Sammons from Area Auto Racing News and asked him what we were projecting to do and who might I get that would be experts in their field. And Mr. Sammons immediately suggested Herb and Steve. We are very happy and very honored to have them here today. I am personally fascinated at both of the things they're going to talk about. Stephen's going to talk about sprint car and open wheel racing in the 20s and 30s, and some guy named Al Capone and what he had to do with racing. And that was the hook that got me psyched on his talk as well. So I certainly want to thank both Herb and Stephen for coming here.
Yes, thank you again. We've certainly enjoyed our presentation, and I'm looking forward to what Stephen has to say.
First off, it's going to be really tough to come up after Herb. That was excellent. My name's Stephen Bubb, and it was really great to get back up in this area. My high school years, I lived across the state line in Towanda. And, I worked for a gentleman who owned a number of tree farms, including one in Dundee, New York. So I'd have to come up here and spend some time in Dundee working at his tree farm. Unfortunate thing was on Fridays I'd have to go home, so I have to go right past Dundee Speedway as the race cars were going in. Always tough to do, being a real true racing fan. A little background, I am from the Harrisburg area. I live right across the river from Harrisburg. Have a fortunate spot because we're right in the middle of a racing hotbed down there. From my house, the wind's blowing right. You can hear Williams Grove Speedway running. You can hear Susquehanna, which is now BAPS Speedway. You can hear that track running. I am the librarian at the Eastern Museum of Motor Racing. I've been retired from work for about a year. I worked in Pennsylvania House of Representatives on staff, and that is why I don't have any hair, because if you work with politicians for 30 years, you lose a lot of hair. And I'm really glad I got retired. Did a lot of things in motorsports. I was a corner flagman, assistant flagman. I've worked on pit crews, done scoring, been a head scorer. I've been a publicity director at Williams Grove Speedway for a while when they had the Saturday night series. I've been very involved in racing, working with the Eastern Museum of Motor Racing as a librarian, which has just been absolutely fascinating. Any museum, like the museum you have here, is a treasure. I hope everybody appreciates what you have here. Each museum, they're priceless, and what we're doing to save racing history, we have to do it because so much racing history is being lost every single day, and we have to preserve every little bit of it. So I'm going to be talking about 1920s and 1930s racing. The United States entered the 1920s having just come out of World War I. The American public was hungry for entertainment. Leading the way in summer sports was naturally baseball. Also attracting plenty of the public's attention was automobile racing. Automobile competition was going through its growing pains as it entered the 1920s. Tracks were plentiful as horse tracks dotted the countryside. As 1920s racing began, there were two basic forms of dirt track competition. There were the stock cars, the road cars of the day. The second form was the engineered machines constructed for the speedway. Now this is Speed Gardner's car. This was from the 1920s, I believe it was 1928 that this photo. The second form is of interest. Today we call them sprint cars. A look at the history of the sprint car shows the name came about late 1950s, 1960. Prior to that time, they were known as big cars. This leads to an interesting discussion that was recently occurred. Racing historians go with what I term the Chris Economaki rule. Economaki, the dean of motorsports, said the term big car came with the arrival of midget racing. When midgets burst upon the scene in 1934 and 1935, promoters began referring to the other racing cars as big cars. This was shown to be true in advertising from the mid-1930s. Racetrack promoters would often state in their advertisements that they were having races featuring big cars, not midgets. So what were the big cars prior to the arrival of midgets? Often newspapers just announced automobile races with no distinction between stock car and manufactured racing machines. One term I found used in newspapers, and the term I use, is speedsters. Another term I noticed was light cars. There is one problem. In 1920s newspapers, mainly in Philadelphia and Altoona, I found where they referenced the cars as big cars. This creates an issue with the Chris Economaki rule. I brought up the concern with noted racing historian Tom Schmee. It left both of us puzzled. And for those of you that know Tom Schmee, tell him I said don't get a big head because I mentioned him today. Tom's a good friend of mine. I decided to look into 1920s usage of big cars, and I came up with two theories. The first is engine size. At some of the races during the 1920s, they split the cars by engine size. They had a class for cars using engines 450 cubic inches and less. There was a second class using engines 320 cubic inches or less. Big car may refer to the cars using the larger engines. A second theory deals with a traveling racing group. In the 1920s, there was a traveling racing group that staged exhibition races. They featured cars called tiny cars. I was fascinated about this form of racing and located a newspaper photograph of a tiny car. They were the forerunner of the Midget, and they're about the same size as a Midget. This car has headlights on it, but it is basically about the same size, and they used an outboard engine like the early Midgets used. Shenley Park, we have discovered, was the first track in Pennsylvania to hold a automobile race. We first thought it was in Philadelphia in 1899, and I was doing some research on 1899 motorcycle racing, and I found results, and it said the winner won a July 4th, 1899 motorcycle race at Shenley Park. And I thought, we have no history of that. So I immediately dug into Pittsburgh newspapers, and sure enough, there was an automobile race July 4th, 1899 at Shenley Park in Pittsburgh. That track is still there. It's now a running track. So Shenley Park was actually the first track in Pennsylvania to hold an automobile race. After discovering the tiny car group, the term big car was possibly used to separate the two forms of cars. For this discussion, I will use the term speedsters. We have speedsters becoming big cars, and big cars eventually becoming a sprint car. As racing entered the 1920s, competition was mainly on horse tracks. There were a few raceways built exclusively for automobile racing. However, the overwhelming number of races were on fairground horse tracks. I do want to point out an interesting aspect to racing research. My history research hero is Joanne Freeman. Ms. Freeman is one of our country's leading historic researchers. Through studying Ms. Freeman's research, I learned that too often we get locked into the well-traveled path. To find missing history nuggets, one must veer off the well-lit, well-traveled path and instead venture into history's dark, unlit alleys. By rooting through history's sometime unkept past, the gems that were missed come to life. Using this line of thought, I went to work on the existence of 1920 racing facilities. Almost every county had a fairground horse track, and automobile races were prevalent at these facilities. What too many researchers miss are the small-town horse tracks. At the time, many small towns still had some type of fairground. By digging into small-town newspapers, suddenly long-lost automobile races came to life at these small-town tracks. Racing was going strong in the 1920s and stronger than many knew. The small-town horse tracks hosted horse racing events. To increase attendance at their horse races, the small-town ovals were adding automobile and motorcycle races. AAA was the main sanctioning body of the time. To have a AAA sanction on your race was a badge of honor. At first, AAA only sanctioned races on tracks a mile or larger. I found an article where a Western Pennsylvania track was able to track AAA. Their horse track was a half mile in size. When they filled out the paperwork for AAA, they listed the track as a mile. The AAA officials were unaware of the discrepancy until they arrived the day of the race. They allowed the race to be held with the AAA sanction, but following the event, they permanently banned the track from staging another AAA race. In the 1920s, AAA was the leading sanctioning body. They did have some competition. The International Motor Contest Association was one of their leading competitors. The American Automobile Racing Corporation was a strong group. AAA and the American Automobile Racing Corporation co-sanctioned races at the Allentown Fairground. Another group trying to make some ground in the racing business was the International Automobile Racing Association. There were smaller racing groups such as the National Motor Racing Association and the Tri-State Racing Association. The racing situation at the time was much the same as our present time. If AAA sanctioned the event, usually a handful of AAA stars would participate in the race. The remainder of the racing field was filled out by local stars. It was a situation that could be compared to our present-day World of Outlaws or All-Star circuit. They bring in some of the star drivers, and the remainder of the field will be local competitors. One star driver every track was hoping to draw was Ralph De Palma. De Palma won the 1915 Indianapolis 500. During his career, at some point, he held every speed record from a half mile to the Indianapolis track. This taking place on track surfaces from dirt, board, and brick. In an interview from the 1920s, De Palma talked about his views on racing. Automobile racing is the cleanest and fairest of all, said De Palma. Lots of people out there believe that every race is fixed before it starts, that every accident is planned by the poor drivers just to give the fans a thrill. They are wrong. Every man who competes in automobile races believes that he is the best in the world. Give a driver a large crowd for whom he can perform, and he will fairly eat up the track, hitting the curves with the gas feed down, roaring on the straight stretches like a demon. The drivers are just too busy trying to reach the top to be bothered by dirty and unfair topics. Then, too, prizes to automobile racers are exceedingly small. Good dirt track drivers make a living, but not much more. Ralph De Palma, in the interview, had an interesting take on racing accidents. He believed that having 3 crashes was almost like having a good luck charm. Every driver suffers 3 mishaps, De Palma explained. It's part of the game's tradition. I've had my 3 crack-ups and have been laid up in the hospital for as long as 7 weeks at a time. I'm not due for more than that sort of thing. 3 and that's all. You think it's funny? Well, we're all glad when the 3rd smash-up has been passed. The 3rd one puts a rabbit foot or some other lucky piece in your car for keeps. So that's an interesting take. He believed that 3 crashes and you were lucky then. Not going to have any other serious wrecks. Ralph De Palma toured the country towing his racing machine. Starting in 1924, he began competing in a Miller Special. The Michigan driver had Wesley Crawford and Reeves Stanley serving as mechanics. De Palma's engine used a supercharger of his own design. De Palma said his engine had a price tag of $10,500. That price tag should raise plenty of eyebrows. When computed to inflation, Ralph De Palma's engine today would cost $158,262. You can buy a lot of 410 engines today for that amount of money. There were other drivers that were touring the nation. Speed Gardner, who we saw in the earlier photo, Ira Vale, IP and Nat Fetterman, Zeke Myers, Jimmy Gleason, Russell Snowberger, Frank Lockhart, Wilbur Shaw, Ernie Triplett are names of drivers that were out on the road. When they arrived at the local track, sometimes there would be stiff competition from the local talent. One such driver was named A.B. Litz, or better known as Deacon Litz. Deacon Litz was from Du Bois, Pennsylvania, and ran a tavern known as the Quiet Woman. There's an interesting story on it, but I won't go into it because it would be called sexist as to why he named it the Quiet Woman. Had something to do with his wife. The local paper referred to Litz as a consistent, non-spectacular speed artist at Du Bois. I don't know if I want to be known as non-spectacular, but that's what he was called. Litz, in his early days, built his own cars and towed to the regional tracks to compete against the national stars. Litz was defeating the big names, and he began to accept better rides. Litz eventually went from local driver to national driver. He competed in 12 Indianapolis 500s. A press release from an October 8, 1927 speedster race at the Bloomsburg Fairground highlighted Deacon Litz. On a day when the grandstands were sold out and people were sitting in the aisles, the racing commenced with an invitational race. Deacon Litz defeated the field of 7 in a 10-lap race. Then his day hit a major issue. Deacon Litz, read the press release, owner of a $20,000 Miller Special, while in time trials, suffered heavy damage to his machine when a piston broke and plunged through the engine block. Automobile men estimated the damage at several $1,000s. Litz previously had won the 5-mile invitational event, and there was every indication he would lead the field in every race in which he participated. Did you take notice in the price of his race car? A $20,000 race car at that time was a top-line machine. When adjusted for inflation today, that race car would be worth $285,262. That's for a dirt track car. An interesting side story on Deacon Litz. When Prohibition hit, Litz was arrested for violating the Prohibition laws. His sentence was to come in May, the same month as the Indianapolis 500. Litz made a deal whereby he pled guilty to violating the prohibition laws. Judge A.R. Chase sentenced Litz to 3 months in county jail along with a fine of $400. As part of the deal, the judge suspended the sentence until December after all racing was completed. Litz cut a real nice deal. Another driver that would take the money from the national stars was named Lafayette Stallman, better known as Leif Stallman. Stallman competed at tracks that were outside the AAA sanction. AAA had a ban on their drivers competing on tracks outside AAA sanction. Some of the drivers did race at non-sanctioned events using an alias, which sometimes makes it difficult for racing historians. Some of the star AAA competitors raced in the outlaw races. The Brookville, Pennsylvania driver traveled around to several states and was quite successful competing in his 16-valve Dodge. In 1924, he made the decision to retire from racing. In the Jefferson Democrat newspaper, Leif Stallman placed an advertisement listing his race car for sale. The advertisement read, "For sale, racing car, elegant condition, equipped with the best racing equipment money can buy. Has record for half-mile track of 29 seconds. Has record for mile track of 52 seconds. Is light and fast. Will sell to the right quick buyer. Reason for selling, am in business and cannot follow it up." Another probable reason for his 1924 retirement came on August 9, 1924. He was leading a race when a lap car crowded him into the fencing. His Dodge struck the fence and a 12-year-old boy that was sitting on the fencing, instantly killing the child. Stallman's car went down an embankment and landed on a sand pile. Stallman had several broken ribs, severe cuts, and a wrenched back. Stallman's retirement was short, though. He built a new car called a Fronta Buick. He took a Frontenac and a Buick, combining parts from both machines. Stallman constructed a new, quick car. Stallman became an outlaw driver long before the term outlaws became popular. He sought out high-paying races around the Middle Atlantic region. In 1926, the new Kensington half-mile track, located north of Pittsburgh, opened. The track, called the $1 Million Speedway due to the cost of building the raceway, opened with a non-sanctioned automobile race. To attract attention, plus drivers and racing fans, the raceway's management decided to pay $1,000 to the winner. Today, many tracks pay $1,000 to the winner. That money brought Leif Stallman. Stallman won the race taking the long route. Noticing the track was rough on the bottom, each lap Stallman was against the outside rail. Stallman estimated he probably ran an extra quarter mile each circuit of the 200-lap race. Stallman's outlaw style caught up to him in 1926. AAA began to move into the tracks that dotted the western section of Pennsylvania. AAA made an ultimatum. You have to join AAA if you want to compete in our races. If you join AAA, you can no longer race at tracks not sanctioned by AAA. On July 24, 1926, Stallman won a AAA-sanctioned race at the Du Bois Fairground. A week later, he was competing in a race not sanctioned by AAA. AAA's action was quick. On August 4, AAA announced Leif Stallman was disqualified from the Du Bois win because the July 31 race was a contest neither sanctioned nor supervised by the contest board. AAA also announced Stallman was permanently barred from any further AAA contests. Stallman's excursion into non-sanctioned field was a particularly flagrant violation of regulations, the AAA board statement said, coming as it did only a few days after the bars had been let down at his most urgent appeal to be permitted to enter sanctioned racing. When the tracks at Butler, Pennsylvania and Mon City, Pennsylvania entered racing last May, all Western Pennsylvania drivers were given an opportunity to join. Stallman was not among those who took advantage of the offer, and later, when he asked to come in, he was refused. He pleaded, however, that he had not been offered the opportunity to enter in May. For that reason, he was admitted on July 23, the day before the Du Bois race, upon the express stipulation that should he ever backslide, he would be permanently out. Yet in the face of that agreement, he raced outside the following week. Neither this board nor the AAA has any quarrel with any promoters, car owners, and drivers outside its sanction, but it does have a standard which is not often equaled. It desires that this standard shall be set an example, that nothing shall dim its present and well-defined leadership, that the attempt it has made to make racing clean and girt with safety shall not be undermined. Unless AAA drivers live up to these standards, they cannot be maintained, and no driver can live up to them by racing today on a track sanctioned by AAA and tomorrow on one that does not qualify. Did that deter Stallman? Not in the least. He continued his outlaw style, working around AAA sanctioned tracks. Continued racing into the early 1930s. The ban by AAA did keep him from making the big next step up the racing ladder. There is one driver from this era that time has forgotten, but he deserves his place in automobile racing fame. His name is Andy Crumshaw. Andy Crumshaw was not a known feature winner, but he was a fascinating story of racing determination. Crumshaw was from Alliance, Ohio. Due to an issue at birth, Crumshaw lost both of his legs at the hip. He also had part of his right arm amputated. Despite the inflictions, Crumshaw went after life with a gusto. Andy Crumshaw was well known in Alliance. He owned and operated the largest newsstand and retail business on the east end of town. Crumshaw never considered himself crippled. One of his great projects was building a car of his own design. Taking several different cars, Crumshaw constructed a luxury car, one that he drove across the country and across southern Canada. Crumshaw loved racing. He took a Frontenac and rebuilt it. He would steer the car with his left arm. Crumshaw made an extension he placed on his right arm. Using that extension, he could operate the gas and the brake. Andy Crumshaw toured around the country. Although the majority of his racing was from Ohio and east, many of the tracks would advertise as upcoming races, stating the invalid driver would be competing. Andy Crumshaw was anything but an invalid. He was a competitive racer and often finished in the top 5. He won a feature at the Ebensburg Fairground. One fascinating thing I find on this is his mechanic has an arm in a sling, and I take it that somewhere along the line the two of them had quite an adventure. Crumshaw's racing did hit a major obstacle in 1927. While racing at Lisbon, Ohio, the leader suddenly slowed and Crumshaw's car made heavy contact. Andy Crumshaw was transported to the hospital and received the bad news. He had broken his left arm, the good arm, placing him on the sidelines for a while. Just before I came up here, I did find another story on Andy. He has apparently a good sense of humor because when he broke that arm, he came back to the track while the races were still going on, went over to the judge's stand, held up the arm in a sling and said, "Look, it's the good arm." So apparently had a very good sense of humor. Racing popularity was strong. This is a young driver just making his start, and it's a driver that anybody that follows racing will know. This is Lenny Duncan, and this is at Deer Park, New York. We think this is probably about 1925, 1926, somewhere in there. We received at Eastern Museum many of Lenny's photos, and this was at the bottom of the box. And one day I was rooting through, and I thought, oh, this is absolutely tremendous. That's an amazing photo. In going through newspaper accounts of races, both AAA and non-sanctioned, the announced crowds were amazing. Often the attendance at half-mile races would be around 20,000, sometimes greater. Racing was profitable, and this money brought the seedier underside into the sport. There were reports of promoters taking the money and running. The sport also attracted the attention of organized crime. I found 2 interesting stories about organized crime in the 1920s. The first came in 1922. It's actually not a dirt track. This is the Uniontown Speedway. It was one of the leading raceways in the country. The criminal element saw an opportunity and began sending individuals into the track to open a betting line. A lot of money was exchanging hands as bets were being placed not only on the outcome of the race, but on other elements of the event. In 1922, the track's management learned of the activity and alerted the police. The Speedway's management issued a press release stating that no gambling will be allowed inside the track's gates. The press release read, "A number of sportily inclined gentlemen have been attempting to make books on the big event, and it is to block the plans of these men. Anyone detected making a bet at the track on Saturday will be ejected without ceremony. There will be a number of police officers in plain clothes stationed throughout the grandstand and infield on Saturday with orders to place anyone under arrest who violates the rules of this respect." The Uniontown newspaper decided to investigate the betting situation. While the Uniontown Speedway management could control the betting inside the track's gates, they had no control outside the raceway. The newspaper found bookies had set up betting. Some of the wagers were what the newspaper called of freakish nature. Some of the wagers discovered by the paper included odds of 2-1 that an accident will occur on Death Curve, where several spills took place. There was even money that none of the cars would change a front tire. 2-1 was offered that none of the drivers would go the entire 225 miles without a stop. There was even money that 1,000 automobiles will be parked inside the speedway. Now, I wonder who had the chore of going in and counting 1,000 automobiles inside the speedway. There was 3-1 that rain will not interfere with the event, and 4-1 that no one will be killed during the race. It was 6-1 that the winner will not lead all the laps, and even money that engine trouble will put at least 2 cars out of the race. Other strange wagers were the winning car will have an odd number, and another bet was on whether the feature winner will be a married man. Racing caught the interest of one of crime's most notable individuals. Mr. Al Capone became involved and staged what might be one of our sport's greatest races. From 1920 through 1933, prohibition was in full force. Al Capone and some of his criminal element were gaining large amounts of money by supplying bootleg alcohol. Capone needed some way to hide and move money. One way was through automobile racing. After Capone was sentenced and on his way to prison, Johnny Black, the former personal and publicity director for driver Barney Oldfield, came forward about Capone and racing. In a newspaper interview, Black talked about Capone and his bootleg buddies using racing. Al Capone was as shrewd in racing as he was in business. To hide some of the money he was making through bootleg alcohol, Capone began to purchase race cars. He bought good cars, often ones that raced at Indianapolis and other big speedways. He made the purchases through a third party, keeping his name out of the deal. The same was true in hiring drivers. It was handled through a third party. The drivers would learn of the car's real owner after the competitors made the final agreement to drive the car. Capone's dealing in racing caught the attention of other operators in the criminal world. Al Capone and some of his principal lieutenants suggested a way to settle differences between factions. Tiring of using Tommy guns to settle differences, they suggested staging an automobile race. When the big Chicago 10-mile race was announced, Johnny Black said, the gangsters entered them under assumed names. They then commenced to select the drivers. The mob heads wanted the best. They were willing to pay the price. They got the best pilots money can buy. Exactly 45 kingpins of speed, swayed by money and orders of the bootleg kings, were on hand to qualify. On race day, there were 45 cars and drivers, all owned by some member of organized crime. A few minutes before the race, the field increased to 47. Drivers Bill Chittum and William Wolf heard about the race and decided to enter. They did so not knowing the circumstance of the race. The race organizers were quite willing to take their entry money. One problem occurred prior to the race. The race starter, the head flagman, apparently being tipped off, took flight and sought safety. Johnny Black had flagging experience and accepted the position. There were 47 cars on hand. Only 18 were going to make the starting field. Johnny Black said that, tersely told that they must earn their stipends from their bootlegger bosses, and that if they laid down and lived after the race, they might look forward to a ride after it. In this atmosphere of death, the pilots threw everything they and their cars had into the speed activities. To the Speed Kings, it looked as if the old Grim Reaper was handling the flags himself that day, with a fateful fate in prospect for the racing pilots if they did not win, and a potential death facing them if they did. Narrowing the 47 cars down to 18 presented some of the most intense racing ever witnessed. By the end of qualifying, the drivers had smashed to smithereens more than 1,000 feet of fencing. Drivers went through holes in the fencing made earlier by other drivers. William Wolf, the outsider that entered the race at the last second, could not believe what he was watching. Unaware of the situation, Wolf commented in an interview about the almost insane racing he was incurring. If you took your foot off the accelerator for a second, Wolf said, not one, but about a dozen cars flashed by you. And those boys were driving. I want to tell you, they were maniacs. I did not understand until afterwards. The best made plans by the gangsters failed on this day. The two outsiders, Wolf and Chittum, finished first and second in the feature. Bill Chittum won, and William Wolf a close second. Upon reporting to the pits, Chittum and Wolf were informed of the race's circumstances. Two quickly gathered their winnings and made a hasty exit of the track. They were not the only ones to make a quick exit of the track. Following the race, flagman Johnny Black received the same information. When I learned after the race that the racketeers had taken this way to settle their disputes instead of with machine guns, and fearful lest I might be blamed for the loss of their cars later, I did not waste much time in Chicago, Black said. The sport of automobile racing had a strong and healthy run through the 1920s. As it entered the 1930s, I noticed something odd. I developed a spreadsheet that I could document Pennsylvania's races from the first one in 1899 to the present. As I looked over the spreadsheet, I noticed a drop in races from 1930 through 1934. At first, I thought maybe I did less research on the time frame. I went back and did research on the races through the years and noticed there was indeed a drop in the races. Then the historian kicked in, the Great Depression. It began in late 1929 and went through much of the 1930s. The 1930s are one of the more fascinating decades in racing. There was a depression and what it did to the sport. Racing received a new breath of life when midget racing swept the sport in the mid-1930s. But then there was the dark side. Racing became a deadly sport during this era to the point I often call the decade the bloody 1930s. First, the Great Depression. It did have an effect on racing. The number of races dropped. There were fewer races held at the small-town fairground ovals. The majority of races were at the established fairground tracks, usually a city track or a county fairground. Although the number of races dropped, the crowds did not. The newspaper accounts continued to report large crowds. Look at baseball attendance during the same time frame. The stronger baseball teams were reporting record crowds while the smaller baseball clubs were struggling. Although money was tight, people still wanted to be entertained. I did notice one trend with racing events. There were mentions about the number of people watching the races for free. People were finding hillsides, trees, anything they could use outside the track grounds to see the races. A race at Arden's Downs is a great example of the hard times. The article mentioned that 27 people were arrested trying to crash the gate at the track. The 27 were taken to Justice of the Peace James Stouffer on charges of trespassing. All 27 were fined $1 plus costs. Showing how hard it was at the time, 25 of the 27 could not afford the $1 plus costs and were committed to the county jail. A day later, family members paid the fines and all but one were released. Times were hard for people, and times were about to become hard for racing. There was a problem brewing, and by the middle of the 1930s, it had become a serious issue. When racing began, the horse tracks were fine for automobile racing. As racing entered the 1930s, the cars were becoming much quicker. As racing went through the decade of the 1930s, racing was outgrowing the horse tracks. The fairground horse tracks had safety features that were fine for horses, not for automobiles. The single-board wood fence could not contain the speedy cars. The fairground complex allowed fans to watch races from almost every inch around the track. The lack of fencing and the spread-out spectators led to deadly results. Frankly, and I have to really say this, there are times I wonder how racing ever survived the 1930s. Week after week, there were newspaper reports of drivers losing their lives. There were numerous reports of fans being killed when cars went through fencing. One of racing's greatest stars, by 1933, became one of its more outspoken opponents. Barney Oldfield, a member of AAA's contest board, suddenly could no longer see a future for the sport, mostly due to the carnage. The San Francisco Examiner newspaper was the perfect place for Oldfield to make a statement about automobile competition. The Examiner was a quite anti-automobile racing paper during the 1930s. Automobile racing has outlived its usefulness, Oldfield said in his interview. It has ceased to be racing and has become merely a morbid and brutal spectacle. The science of speed has reached a point where any manufacturer can produce a car which will satisfy any sane buyer. Few of your average automobile race fans know or care anything about the finer points of the cars or the racers. They watch without interest the most skillful and delicate driver, but let a tire burst, a wheel skid, a car brake for the fence, and they are out of their seats in a flash. A soft spot on the track, a piece of broken metal, a speck of dirt in an oil feed, these things and not engines, experience, or skill are the things which win automobile races now. Racing cars are now too fast for the tracks, and I doubt safe tracks can ever be constructed, especially with the demand for more speed and more hazards. As for the proposal to require promoters to post bonds to provide for the dependents of those killed or permanently injured, Henry Ford took out insurance on every driver and mechanic as a personal gift to them. I quit racing for two reasons. First, there is no money or future in it for the driver. Second, because of the ever-increasing dangers with the demand of speed and more risks. I knew I would get mine someday if I continued on, and I doubt if any kind of examination can ensure that the drivers in a race are physically or mentally fit to enter. Why, Tommy Milton, one of the greatest of racers, drove for years and he was blind in one eye. Bill Denver, who raced at Indianapolis, had an arm he couldn't even bend. If there must be automobile racing, I favor a return to strictly stock car racing and the elimination of specially built racers, constructed for speed alone. These frail, highly powered cars built for racing are a danger to the driver and themselves. When there is a crash, they crumble like tin. Although the government, for the most part, remained out of racing, some local governments stepped in to increase safety. In August of 1937, the government of South Bend, Indiana, decided to pass a bill regarding the safety at the Playland Park racetrack. The editorial staff of the South Bend Tribune supported the bill. The members of the city council have shown sound judgment in making a bill to protect spectators when automobile races are held at Playland Park, the editorial read. The new ordinance requires that a promoter of such races must pay a license fee of $100, be insured to the amount of $5,000 a person and $100,000 an accident. The insurance must be with a company listed at no less than $1 million, and that a retaining wall must be erected to protect spectators. This ordinance will be regarded by automobile race promoters as exceedingly severe, but it will be endorsed by spectators and thoughtful persons who have the good sense to appreciate why it was created. There was one major safety issue, and that was dust. In researching racing during the 1930s, so many articles mention the dust. Dirt horse tracks, paired with the increasing power and speed of the cars, brought billowing, blinding dust. The dust dramatically increased the danger factor of automobile races. I found two interesting stories that highlight the dust dilemma. The first was at the Bloomsburg Fairground. The main event began at the Bloomsburg Fairground, and immediately dust rose from the racing action. In the early laps, a car crashed into the fencing, entering the third turn. The impact sent the driver hurtling out of the car, his body landing on the track. The accident occurred in front of the ambulance crew. With the heavy dust, the race officials were unaware a crash occurred in the third turn. The ambulance crew bravely went over the fence and pulled the injured driver from the track. They placed him in the ambulance and quickly left for the hospital. When the driver arrived at the hospital staff wanted more information on their patient. They called the track asking for information on the driver injured during the race. Track officials, still unaware a crash occurred, told the hospital staff person there must be some mistake. No one was injured during the race. The staff person replied, "We have a driver here. He is injured. He was injured at your track." The track official replied, "They were mistaken," and hung up. After the race was completed, the dust dissipated, and to the surprise of the track officials, there was a wrecked car against the third turn fence. The second story comes from the Monongahela City track. Their big race was well underway. During the race, two cars crashed exiting the second turn. With what was described as blinding dust, other cars crashed into the accident scene. The head flagman, not able to see much at all due to the dust, was unaware of the wreck. The accident continued to grow as more cars became involved. The head flagman became aware of the fact that there were less and less cars coming by the starting line, so he signaled for a stoppage to the race. This worked for everyone except the leader. The driver in the lead car refused to stop, fearing he could possibly be passed. He continued circling the track despite frantic efforts to halt him. Finally, a Pennsylvania state policeman had enough. The officer walked out onto the track and drew his pistol. He stood waiting, and as soon as the leader appeared out of the dust, the officer took aim at the radiator. The car's driver, suddenly spotting an officer aiming a gun at his car, quickly brought his machine to a halt. The sad part to the story is a driver did die in the crash. The majority of the field was eliminated in the wreck, most not being able to see due to the dust. Racetrack owners and promoters were experimenting with calcium as a way to control the dust. Adding crude oil to the surface was another way to hamper the dust. Earlier I mentioned the New Kensington track. There's a popular story told about an inventive way they handled their dust issue. The track was located close to a paint factory. The story told is that the promoter went to the paint factory and purchased their unused and unwanted paint. He then applied the paint to the track surface for a midget race. The paint was not popular with the drivers. It did hinder the dust, but it also adhered to the cars and the drivers. One driver actually said his car changed colors during the race. He had a dark colored car and it was silver when he came out of the race. For a racing historian, parts of the 1930s were not fun to research. The crashes were brutal, and the newspaper writers described them with a flair not found today. Herb mentioned that about the one writer. Back then, writers really described the crashes. I was researching a July 4th, 1936 race at Jenner's Speedway that had a double fatality. The writer from a small-town newspaper described the accident with such detail that it was absolutely, I guess the best word would be horrific. That is when I began to wonder how racing survived the 1930s. When you read Chris Economaki's tremendous book, Let 'Em All Go, and if you haven't read it, definitely read it, you begin to understand the decade and the racing. Death was accepted as a risk with the sport. As Economaki pointed out, if a driver perished in a crash, they cleared the accident scene and went back to racing. This occurred with the Jenner's crash. As horrendous as the crash was, they cleared the incident and went right back to racing. AAA continued to be the leader of race sanctioning. AAA took a firm control of any rough riding during their events. They started to crack down because of the accidents. This is the actual AAA transcripts that we have at the Eastern Museum. And this is an incident that occurred on November 11th, 1934 at Ascot Speedway in Los Angeles. This is the original transcript, and it's quite long. Floyd Roberts and Kelly Patillo were fighting for a lead on the last lap when Roberts was accused of forcing Patillo off the track. The AAA hearing board held a hearing to decide if punishment was due. And that's what this whole document is. This is the hearing. At the end of the hearing, the members were told the punishment that could be handed down if needed. The rules governing are contained in the rules book, page 101, section 293, particularly part C, which says foul driving either in a contest or practice shall be deemed a breach of these rules and shall be punished by exclusion from all events of the meeting, and the offender may be fined or suspended for such time as the contest board may determine. Read the document. Penalties may be inflicted as follows: fines, exclusions, suspensions, disqualifications. If you find Roberts guilty of this offense, you can recommend a fine or you can bar him from any future races for a future length of time. You can recommend suspensions for a given length of time, or you can recommend disqualifications to the contest board. If you find Roberts guilty, you can exercise what might be in your judgment a just penalty, or you can take the alternative and file your recommendations with the board in order that the prize money be impounded. In other words, I see no other way, if he is guilty, where you can arbitrarily say he can be penalized from first to 32nd. He won the races without penalty being inflicted during the course of the event, and we as a board have no power to rerun the race. If you feel he is not entitled to first place in this event, I think it would be proper then for you to refer the matter to the board. In the end, the board decided that Roberts committed no foul. When you read this, it got quite heated during that board meeting. Although AAA was the leading sanctioning body, another organization was making a challenge. The Central States Racing Association, also called Consolidated States Racing Association, was taking aim at AAA. At the Eastern Museum of Motor Racing, we have the CSRA paperwork. In reading the correspondence, CSRA was looking to take AAA off its lofty position. CSRA began to move into AAA areas, and more tracks switched over to CSRA. Racing was still going through some growing pains. The early part of the 1930s found the majority of races still being held on horse tracks. By the second half of the decade, racing began moving away from the horse tracks to new raceways. Some of these tracks had interesting stories. One was the Landisville Speedway. The Landisville Speedway was actually a football stadium for a semi-pro football team. As automobile racing interest increased, the owner of the facility and the football team saw an opportunity. He decided to race the speedsters around the football field during the football game intermissions. Now fans could receive twice the entertainment for the money. A football game with an automobile race at intermission. The cars raced on a track built around the football field. His great plan hit a major snag one day. During the intermission race, one car veered off the track and crashed into the goalpost, sending the goalpost toppling to the ground. For the second half, all extra points and field goals had to be kicked on one end of the field. There were two saviors of the sport. The first was the realization of the need to build racing facilities exclusively for automobile racing. By the mid-1930s, the move away from the horse tracks began. The new tracks were constructed with banking in the turns, better suited for automobile speed. The fencing was built at a height to better contain automobiles. One of the strongest improvements, the grandstand seating, was such that it contained the crowd in one area. No longer were spectators spread out around the track. Now fans can be confined to a grandstand along a straightaway. The sudden construction of new speedways led to an interesting situation in my home area. In 1939, construction began on two speedways. Oddly enough, both were being built in amusement parks. The first was at an unincorporated area known as Hershey. The second was at a small railroad hamlet known as Williams Grove. Roy Richwine was leading the construction of the new Williams Grove track, while Milton Hershey of Hershey chocolate fame was heading up the Hershey project. Many do not realize Milton Hershey was a racing enthusiast. Around 1920, he bought a large amount of land outside of the Hershey area. Milton Hershey bought it with a vision of constructing a large road racing course. That plan never came to life. Milton Hershey and Roy Richwine suddenly realized they had a problem. Both of their new tracks were going to open the same week. The two agreed to have a meeting. At the end of the meeting, they came to agreement. The Hershey Speedway would open on Thursday and Williams Grove would open on Sunday. The second savior of the sport came, according to racing historian Crocky Wright, on June 4, 1933, at the Hughes Stadium in Sacramento, California. On that day, a new form of racing came to life. Midget racing was born and would soon be sweeping eastward. On June 10, 1934, promoter Bill Putnam staged the first Eastern Midget race. This held at Olympic Park in Irvington, New Jersey. Malcolm McKenzie is listed as winning the first Eastern Midget race. As 1934 progressed, midget racing spread through New Jersey and New York. At first, the cars were crude, but the sport attracted the attention of speedster stars. Soon, Bill Holmes, Bill Morrissey, Bill Schindler, Doc McKenzie, and a young driver known as Len Dumpkin were competing in the midgets. By 1935, the sport had grown enough that the East Midgets had their first drivers group with the formation of the Eastern Auto Racing Association. Soon, the Interstate Racing Association, the Keystone Racing Association, and the American Midget Racing Association were a part of the 1935 racing scene. Promoter Bill Heiserman introduced a new form of lining up the cars called handicapping, or reverse start. It met with resistance at first, but by the end of 1935, it became accepted. Midget racing captured the fascination of the American public. The small racing machines could race in new forms of racing venues. The high school stadiums became a popular racing facility as the small machines battled on the high school tracks. Stadiums of all types, be it football or baseball, were now new venues for the midgets. The popularity of the midgets cannot be understated. Promoter Bill Heiserman stated that he paid out $192,018.50 in midget purses in just 1934 and 1935. Using the inflation calculator today, that would be $3,555,078 for midget racing in 2 years. One driver had a quick jump on midget competition. Bill Betterman of Los Angeles, California, became a quick star in midget competition. Betteridge was a part of the earlier mentioned Tiny Car group. Betteridge was the 1934 West Coast Midget Champion. By 1934, the midgets had a number of venues around Los Angeles area. Tracks such as Moto Stadium, Gilmore Stadium, Loyola Stadium, Pershing Park, and Seaside Park were midget havens. Of those tracks, only one remains. Seaside Park today is Ventura Speedway. Gilmore Stadium is actually the CBS Studios in Los Angeles. A 1934 press release captured the popularity of West Coast midget racing and the popularity of driver Bill Betteridge. The number one topic on West Coast these days is the birth of the exciting sport of midget auto racing, which has been playing before banner crowds, stated the release. Most of that excitement has been produced by a smiling young teenager named Billy Betteridge, who has just been proclaimed the 1934 West Coast Midget Champion. This clean-cut Los Angeles youngster built a so-called experimental midget back in 1932 and ran a few exhibitions with it. When Ken Brenneman and Hap Woodman decided to join forces and get others interested in the small cars, Billy Betteridge was attracted to this group, and it wasn't long until he was in the thick of things. Billy Betteridge had fooled around with the marine outboards for a couple of years and felt that the Cayley outboard engine would be suitable to mount in his homemade chassis. Little did he realize the eventual success that was about to come his way. Betteridge was lauded by many who witnessed the little car in action. Betteridge and his Cayley were the combination, and after 4 promising outings in 1933 at Loyola Stadium, he came into his own during the past season. He racked up a phenomenal record of 30 midget wins, and with 8 straight at Gilmore Stadium and 6 out of 8 starts at Moto Stadium in Long Beach. Billy finds enough time out of a busy schedule to teach Sunday school class and focuses on clean living, mentally and physically prepared, and will and determination to win. That's what he has done. He's just made to order for the mantle of a champion and displays the humility of one of racing's finest personality. Betteridge's story comes to an unfortunate end. On June 8, 1937, he was fatally injured in a wreck on the opening lap of a feature at Atlantic Stadium. Billy Betteridge, a point champion at Moto Stadium and the National Midget Circuit of California champion, left an impression on West Coast fans, as per this press release note. The greatest tribute ever paid a driver, stated the release, was given Betteridge when 6,000 fans to a man remained for over an hour patiently waiting for an announcement as to his condition. When the announcement finally came, they were told that their beloved idol had passed on. They filed out in silence. On the East Coast, midget racing opened the sports door for many aspiring drivers. One was Joe Pacino from Woodside, Long Island. He started his driving career with the speedsters but struggled. The midgets offered a new opportunity, and Pacino took advantage of the new sport. Although not a known feature winner, Pacino was on top of his game in qualifying, winning a number of heats and semifinals. Joe Pacino is typical of quite a number of struggling young men in the sport of auto racing, read a press release, who have been following a dream. Joe's early schooling goes back to 1934 when he broke in with the Garden State Association in an attempt to make it. He encountered the same problems as those who preceded him, the lack of good equipment, but there was a ray of hope during the initial season in which he placed in the top 5 in a race meet staged at Woodbridge, New Jersey. This was enough to keep him focused. He sat out the 35 season due to the lack of a decent ride, but in 1936, we find him taking part in 19 midget races, namely Bridgeport, Philadelphia, West Haven, and Freeport. He tried his hand with a marine-type power plant known as the Van Blurk, but has since shifted his attention to the Ford 60, which is proving to provide that necessary step to move his career along. Born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Joe now makes his home on Long Island, which puts him in close proximity with the tracks that make up the Heiserman circuit. Midget racing became so popular, it was almost possible for a driver and race team to compete every night. This book, this was compiled by Carl Swigert, highlights the yearly racing of star drivers, and this is each race that they did, and this whole book is different drivers, and it is every single race. The first one is Billy Betteridge, who's up here. The yellow on here is actually all of Billy's feature wins. At the Eastern Museum of Motor Racing, we have a number of books by Carl Swigert and Joe Heisler, and it documents every single one of these midget stars, where they traveled, how they did in qualifying and features. And there's an interesting aspect to this, and that is travel. We have to remember that this was prior to the freeways. Travel was not easy during this time. Race teams went great distances. It was not unusual to see a note of a driver competing in the Midwest on one night, and a day or two later he was racing on the East Coast. There were no modern hotels, no fancy racing rigs, no chain restaurants, no fast food. These competitors were true racers, putting up with hardships of the road. And it is amazing when you look through here to see they raced night after night. One night they could be in Pennsylvania, and the next night in New England. The following night they could be in New Jersey. These guys really, really traveled. Midget racing went through its growing pains. With the cars available to race at so many venues, there was going to be some problems. Even a new facility as Hershey Stadium, with a strong money backing and a strong sanctioning body in CSRA, had issues. The day following the opening midget race at Hershey, Jack Conlon, the sports editor of the Harrisburg Patriot News, had an interesting look at the racing. The other evening at Hershey, wrote Conlon, when the midget auto races were inaugurated, more than 11,000 fans turned out. At least a half a dozen times during the evening, the announcer called upon the audience to applaud. The announcer who begs for applause insults the intelligence of the public just as much, if not more, than the public speaker who says, "Do you see what I mean?" Many persons who attend an auto race for the thrills they expect to see, but the majority attend because they love the sport and that is their favorite diversion. Perhaps we're different. We would have come away from the track the other evening thoroughly enjoyed with the program if it wasn't for the fact that they were continually reminding us that it was time to applaud. It was really humorous for a while. Things are not usually done that way in Hershey. Here's hoping that those in charge of the midget races fall in line real soon. If you had not become disgusted with the announcer and were willing to endure more, all you had to do was try and get some refreshments during intermission. Picture the greater party of 11,000 fans trying to get service with only 2 persons selling tickets, and then less than a half dozen attendants endeavoring to serve the huge throng. Talk about a day at the races. You ain't seen nothing until you've gone through what we did the other night. However, we must admit it was the first race, and many of these conditions are likely to be remedied before long. On a side note, Hershey almost came to an explosive end in that first year. They were scheduled to have a large fireworks display with the races. The races and the fireworks were rained out, so Milton Hershey instructed the workers to store the fireworks under the front straightaway grandstands. During the week, a worker tossed a cigarette and it landed in the fireworks. This created a large explosive scene under the grandstands. Thankfully, the grandstands were made of concrete and were able to withstand the explosion. Husted Field is a prime example of the growing pains of midget racing. Husted Field was a multiple-purpose sports facility. The complex included a football field and running track. The midgets were scheduled to race on the running track. The event was a qualifier for a race to be held at Madison Square Garden in New York. The local newspaper added some pre-life excitement to the event. And once again, this is what I said about writers at the time having a flair. The newspaper article read, "Life and limb will be endangered Saturday afternoon at Husted Field when the cream of the daredevil drivers will whirl around the 5th-mile track at speeds faster than a mile a minute. The midget automobiles to participate have carried several drivers to their deaths and have sent numerous drivers to the hospital. Due to the nature of the local track, accidents seem imminent. A large crowd is certain to turn out for the large races. The cars are not playthings by any means. Doctors and nurses will be on hand in case of emergency." Lovely way to sum up the races that are coming. On race day, a total of 8 midgets were at the track. The Husted brothers, who owned the facility, had other concerns. The expected large crowd was not there, so the Husted brothers began taking account of the spectators. As the practice session began, the Husted brothers asked the promoter how much he was paying in insurance. The promoter replied he had no insurance on the race. They then asked if he had enough money to pay the drivers. The promoter stated that with 8 cars, he believed he had enough money to pay the drivers. At the end of practice, the Husted brothers made the announcement they were canceling the races and all patrons would receive a refund. By 1938, midget racing was booming. Eastern Midget Racing Alliance was formed as a way to protect the drivers. The alliance was there to make sure the drivers received a fair purse. This group quickly ran into opposition. AAA wanted to be part of the East Midget scene. In March, AAA met with the National Midget Auto Racing Circuit. AAA took over the circuit's schedule, and now AAA was firmly in place in the East. To show the strength of AAA, this was their weekly East Midget schedule. Sunday nights, they had racing at Nutley Velodrome and the Coney Island Velodrome. On Monday, they sanctioned races at Cedarhurst and Bridgeport. Tuesday night, they were at Yellow Jacket and the Bronx Castle Hill. Wednesday night, they were back at Nutley and Coney Island. Thursday, they returned to Cedarhurst and West Haven. Friday nights were for Yellow Jacket and Bronx Castle Hill. And they finished the week on Saturday at Long Branch. That is 14 races in 1 week for AAA. And that was all season long. There is one track on that list that needs mentioning. The Nutley Velodrome. The Nutley Velodrome was a bicycle track located in Nutley, New Jersey. And Herb mentioned about this earlier. The track was a 6-mile in distance, 45-degree banking in the turns. People thought promoter Jack Kochman was crazy when he suggested racing midgets at the Velodrome. Even Kochman had some doubts when he enlisted drivers Bill Scarnates and Red Redmond to take some practice laps. Following that section, Kochman believed midgets could race on the Velodrome surface. Kochman had an open practice, and the first driver on the track, Ernie Gessel, turned a lap in 8.4 seconds at a speed of 72 miles per hour. That's 72 miles per hour on a 6-mile track. By the second practice session, they had lap times under 8 seconds. Racing great Tommy Hinnershitz once talked about racing at Nutley. With the track's small size and steep banking, Hinnershitz said you would lose all perspective when on the track. Cars would circle the track so quickly that you would lose track of which straightaway or which turn you were in. He said you would go up, you would go down, you would go up, go down constantly. You had no idea where you were on the track. Driver Henry Banks supported Hinnershitz's claim. Banks, in an interview, said, "Driving this steeply banked track was an experience without comparison. Because of the blinding speeds, a driver never knew just where he was on the banks." The track was doomed from its opening day. Ken Fowler's crash into the outside railing injured 13 spectators. The local residents were unhappy over the massive traffic jams, and they considered the track a nuisance. A group of citizens asked for a revocation of the racing permit, but town mayor Frederick Young allowed racing to continue. What was interesting about Nutley opening was the Tri-City Speedway opened the same night, and the two tracks were only a few miles apart. Tri-City had 41 cars, while Nutley had just over 20. However, Nutley had a sellout crowd, whereas Tri-City had a slim turnout. Nutley's lifespan was just over 1 year. On August 8, 1939, Carl Hattel was killed in an accident. He was the third fatality in 60 races at the Velodrome. The town of Nutley had enough and racing was banned from the Velodrome. In March 1942, the Nutley Velodrome was torn down and today it's a park. With midget racing booming and big car competition continuing, a good problem arose. There were too many races. Drivers and cars were being stretched thin. Promoters began to complain as the racing schedule filled drastically. The problem became pronounced in the fall when the county fairs were at their height. In central Pennsylvania, there was the Lebanon Fairground with its weekly big car races. A half-mile north of the fairground was the Pleasant Hill Gun Club Midget track. Both raced on Sundays. Adding to the confusion, just outside of Lancaster was the Central Speedway and their weekly big car events. Lebanon promoter Mark Light, who was also a noted race car driver, knew this was not going to work. Light held a meeting with the other promoters and they came up with a solution. Lebanon and Central would alternate weeks with their big car races. Pleasant Hill held midget races on the Sundays when Lebanon was not racing. As the 1930s came to an end, another form of racing was gaining ground in sections of the country. Jalopy racing was making a hit. The crude racing machines, often stripped down to the frames, could race almost anywhere, often in open fields on autocross-style tracks. This very cheap form of racing became a sudden moneymaker proposition. Fire companies and other local organizations staged jalopy races as fundraisers. All of this great racing was about to come to an end as the war in Europe was increasing. By 1942, the government shut down automobile racing in its entirety. Well, almost, because we did find some articles. There was some kind of what we, I guess, could call outlaw racing during the ban that did go on. The tracks became idle until late 1945. The momentum racing gained in the 1920s and 1930s was lost due to the war effort. And I want to close out with this article that we found at the museum in the bottom of a box. It was from Mr. Ray Sherman, who's the associate chairman of the contest board of the American Automobile Association. It's entitled, "The Racing Driver's Gift to All of Us Who Drive." And this was from May of 1929. It's a kind of just a very interesting read. This summer, as in many summers past, racing cars will roar over the bricks and the boards and through the dust of the dirt tracks while crowds thrill and cheer. To them, it will be a spectacle of sport staged for their amusement. To most of the drivers, it will be a competition for cash rewards. But to the car owners of the world, it will be more than that. Had it not been for the racers of the days gone by, the world would be not so far along the path of progress. Our civilization will be a different thing. Our people would have less enjoyment of life than they would have today. America seems to have leaped from the mud of 30 years ago to the concrete of today and all that goes with it. It did leap, and much of the impetus that made the leap of so long came from the roaring mortars of the tracks and from the sweaty, grimy hands that held to the wheels and from the thick shod feet that pressed hot pedals to the boards. Time was when a tire was a treacherous, uncertain thing. It was a creature of hope or despair, according to whether it had or had not played the tricks upon its owner. Better tires? Maybe someday. Then the racer went out upon the tracks and burned them up and tore them apart till the fame of the Goodyears and all the rest of them began to dim. And then came better tires that brought back luster to the old trade names. Under hard pounding on the bricks and the rough usage on dangerous turns, steering knuckles, the soul of the driving safety cracked. Each crack brought its penalty to some men. And then engineers went back to laboratories and shops and came forth again with steering knuckles that would not break. And every part of a car went through a grind. Without much, cars of today would not be what they are. In the great scheme of things, a contributions to the welfare of the world. And back of each test, behind each motor, had to be the hands of a man, a racing driver. This summer, 20 million of Americans' families will roll over the roads in automobiles. Fathers, mothers, children will sail at fast speeds on tires that make for safety. Cars with human freight will be pushed up frightful grades, and gears and axles will not break. Steep descents, sudden stops, all in safety. A rambling tour through sylvan scenes is far removed from the roar and risk of the tracks, but no one could have been made without the other. The no man's land of science has always lured the few, and the many have always reaped the real rewards. Perhaps someday a public place may hold a monument to the real racing driver, the man who brought safety to all who drive. I thank everybody for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
This episode is brought to you in part by the International Motor Racing Research Center. Its charter is to collect, share, and preserve the history of motorsports, spanning continents, eras, and race series. The center's collection embodies the speed, drama, and camaraderie of amateur and professional motor racing throughout the world. The center welcomes serious researchers and casual fans alike to share stories of race drivers, race series, and race cars captured on their shelves and walls and brought to life through a regular calendar of public lectures and special events. To learn more about the center, visit www.racingarchives.org. This episode is also brought to you by the Society of Automotive Historians. They encourage research into any aspect of automotive history. The SAH actively supports the compilation and preservation of papers, organizational records, print ephemera, and images to safeguard, as well as to broaden and deepen the understanding of motorized, wheeled land transportation through the modern age and into the future. For more information about the SAH, visit www.autohistory.org.
We hope you enjoyed another awesome episode of Break Fix Podcast, brought to you by Grand Touring Motorsports. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved, be sure to follow us on all social media platforms at Grand Touring Motorsports. And if you'd like to learn more about the content of this episode, be sure to check out the follow-on article at gtmotorsports.org. We remain a commercial-free and no annual fees organization through our sponsors, but also through the generous support of our fans, families, and friends through Patreon. For as little as $2.50 a month, you can get access to more behind-the-scenes action, additional pit stop minisodes, and other VIP goodies, as well as keeping our team of creators fed on their strict diet of Fig Newtons, gummy bears, and Monster. So consider signing up for Patreon today at www.patreon.com/GT Motorsports. And remember, without you, none of this would be possible.